The station sat alone on the northern edge of Black Hollow Lake, a low, concrete structure half buried by snowdrifts, its windows permanently frosted from the inside. No road reached it in winter. Supplies were brought once a month by snowcat, weather permitting, and the rest of the time, the lake and the station existed together in isolation, sealed off from the rest of the world by trees, ice, and silence. Officially, the site monitored seasonal ice pressure and structural integrity. Unofficially, nobody ever explained why a night guard was still required when the system had been fully automated years ago. His name was Ethan Hale, and he had worked the winter shift for 3 months. Every night followed the same routine. He arrived before dusk, logged the sensor readings, checked the backup generators, and settled into the long hours of listening. The lake made noise. All frozen lakes did. Sharp cracks, distant groans, the slow, stretching complaints of ice under stress. At first, Ethan found the sounds unsettling. Then they became background, like wind through power lines, something you noticed only when it stopped. The lake was frozen solid, more than a meter thick according to the last measurement. No open water, no visible fractures, no currents. And yet, shortly after midnight, the ice began to move. It wasn't dramatic, no splitting or buckling, just a subtle rise beneath the snow, followed by a slow release. The instruments caught it before Ethan did, a gentle vertical displacement, barely a few centimeters.
Then, minutes later, it happened again. Up, down, perfectly smooth. At first he assumed a calibration error, thermal expansion maybe. He noted it in the log and reset the system. The pattern continued. By 1 a.m., the rhythm had settled into something uncomfortably regular. Ethan leaned back in his chair and listened. The station was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the lake rose again, pressing upward against its frozen shell, then easing back. The timing was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. When he realized, the thought made his chest tighten. The movement matched his breathing. He tested it without meaning to. He inhaled slowly. The next upward motion of the ice lagged behind by a second, then followed through, smooth and deliberate. He exhaled. The lake sank. Not immediately. Nothing about it felt reactive, but it adjusted, like something sinking rather than responding. Ethan stood and walked to the window. The snow-covered surface looked unchanged, flat and undisturbed beneath the floodlights. No ripples, no cracks, nothing that should move at all. And yet, the instruments insisted otherwise. The lake continued its slow, steady rise and fall, as if something vast beneath the ice was breathing through it. He pulled the old paper logs from the shelf beneath the console. Most of them were routine, filled with identical entries night after night. Temperature stable, ice thickness within tolerance, no anomalies. Then, near the back of one binder, he found older pages written in a different hand. The language was careful, restrained, but the meaning was clear. Vertical oscillation observed. No fracture activity. Cycle persists despite temperature drop. Soundless movement feels deliberate. Each of those entries ended the same way, with a single line underlined twice. Do not remain during full synchronization. Ethan checked the date. The entries stopped abruptly 30 years ago. Outside, the lake rose again, just a little higher this time. The station's floor vibrated softly beneath his boots, not with force, but with presence. He became acutely aware of his own breathing,
of the way his chest expanded and contracted, of how the room seemed to wait between each inhale. He tried holding his breath. The movement beneath the ice slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed felt wrong, heavier than the cold. Ethan exhaled sharply, and a moment later, the lake resumed its rhythm, smoother than before, as if relieved. Something beneath the ice was listening. And for the first time since taking the job, Ethan understood that the station wasn't here to observe the lake. It was here to make sure someone was always being observed back. By 2 a.m., Ethan had stopped pretending the readings were accidental. The lake's oscillation had stabilized into a near-perfect cycle, rising and falling with a consistency no natural process should maintain under frozen conditions. The sensors confirmed what his body already felt: pressure changes traveling upward through the ice, subtle enough to avoid fractures, controlled enough to suggest restraint. Whatever lay beneath Black Hollow Lake was not pushing blindly. It was regulating itself. He forced himself back into routine, clinging to habit like a lifeline. Generator check. Battery backup nominal. External cameras clear. The floodlights illuminated nothing but snow and ice, a white emptiness stretching to the tree line.
Yet even as he looked, he felt watched. Not from the darkness beyond the lights, but from directly below his feet. The sensation was intimate and invasive, like standing over someone pretending to sleep. At 2:17 a.m., the hydrostatic pressure sensor spiked. Not dramatically, just enough to trigger a soft alert tone. Ethan leaned toward the monitor as the graph redrew itself, a new line appearing beneath the main oscillation. Smaller, faster, irregular. Something else was moving now, deeper than the primary mass, shifting position rather than breathing. The lake floor itself seemed to flex in response. He scrolled through historical data, hands moving faster than his thoughts. The archived files were incomplete, corrupted in places, but a pattern emerged. Every few decades, the same anomaly appeared for a brief window during the coldest part of winter. Always at night, always during long, uninterrupted shifts, always followed by a sudden termination of records. Not equipment failure, administrative closure, sites decommissioned, personnel reassigned or listed as resigned without forwarding information. Ethan checked the date and felt his stomach drop. The synchronization window, according to the old data, peaked tonight. A sound reached him then, faint enough that he might have dismissed it hours earlier. Not cracking ice, not wind. A low, liquid pressure noise, like water being forced slowly through a narrow space. It didn't come from outside. It came from below the station, traveling up through the concrete foundation, resonating in his bones more than his ears. He backed away from the window and nearly tripped over the open log binder on the floor. One page had come loose, yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was cramped, urgent, the ink pressed so hard it had torn the paper in places. "It is not trapped," the note read. "The ice is a lid, not a prison. It stays because it is easier." Another line followed, written later, shakier. "When it finishes aligning, it will test the surface." The pressure readings jumped again, higher this time. Ethan felt it in his chest, a deep compression followed by release, as if the lake were adjusting its internal shape. The secondary movement beneath the primary mass shifted closer to the station. The depth indicator recalculated automatically, numbers changing too quickly to track. Whatever was down there was rising, not toward the surface, but toward him. He tried the radio. Static. He tried the emergency uplink. No signal. The station had been isolated before, but never like this.
The silence wasn't empty. It felt enforced, as though the surrounding air itself had been muted. Outside, the snow on the lake's surface began to slide, not blown by wind, but pushed gently aside in slow, circular patterns. Floodlights revealed shallow depressions forming beneath the ice, vast and shallow, like the outline of something turning beneath a sheet. Ethan pressed his palm against the glass and felt warmth, not from the heater, from below. The oscillations slowed. Each rise now took longer, higher than before, followed by a careful descent. The rhythm no longer matched Ethan's breathing. It was setting its own pace, testing independence. The secondary movement stopped entirely, as if whatever part of the thing moved freely had finished repositioning. A new alert appeared on the console, one he had never seen before. No alarm sound accompanied it, just a line of text, stark and unblinking. Synchronization, 89%. Ethan stepped back, heart hammering, and finally understood the true purpose of the night guard. The lake did not need monitoring. It needed a reference point, a living constant above the ice.
Someone breathing, someone warm, someone finite.
The pressure beneath the station increased again, and this time the concrete floor responded with a low, distant creak. Not cracking, yielding. Whatever lived in Black Hollow Lake was almost ready, and it was no longer content to breathe alone. By the time the ice began to hum, Elias understood that the lake was no longer reacting to them. It was preparing. The sound came from beneath the frozen surface, low and resonant, like a submerged engine slowly turning over after decades of silence. It vibrated through the soles of his boots and up his spine, steady and patient, unconcerned with whether anyone was listening. The instruments confirmed what his instincts already knew. The water temperature below the ice had dropped further, impossibly low. Yet movement had increased, massive displacements rolling through the depths as if something vast was changing position. The lake was not empty. It never had been. They attempted to abort the operation. Satellite uplink failed first, then shortwave, then even the emergency beacon dissolved into static that sounded disturbingly like breath. The forest surrounding the research site had gone still, not the quiet of snowfall, but the kind of silence that follows a warning animals understand before humans do. Elias noticed the old fishing huts along the shore for the first time since arriving. Their doors open, interiors stripped bare, walls marked with vertical gouges that no ice tool could have made. Symbols had been carved there too, older than the ones found upriver, repetitive and circular, as if someone had tried to describe motion with a knife. The ice cracked once, sharply, directly beneath the central sensor array. Not a fracture, but a deliberate release of pressure, like a knuckle popping. The hum deepened.
One of the researchers dropped to their knees, clutching their head, whispering numbers that matched the depth readings scrolling across the monitor. Elias pulled them away, just as the ice beneath the array began to darken. Not from water, but from shadow. Something moved under the frozen surface, slow and careful, aligning itself precisely below them. What emerged was not a breach, not a dramatic explosion of ice and spray. The lake did not thrash or rage. Instead, the ice thinned, becoming translucent, as if the water itself was dissolving it from below. Through it, Elias saw a shape that refused to settle into anatomy. Too long, too layered, its mass folding over itself like overlapping currents frozen into flesh. Pale ridges glowed faintly along its length, bioluminescent lines pulsing in a rhythm that matched the hum. Where a head should have been, there was only a widening convergence of movement, a place where the water bent inward toward a single point of attention. The lake was looking up. Elias understood then why the old reports spoke of drownings in winter, bodies found beneath intact ice, faces frozen in expressions of understanding rather than fear. This was not a predator that chased or hunted. It waited until something synchronized with it. Sound, motion, intention, and then simply allowed itself to be perceived. The moment you saw it clearly, you became part of the system that sustained it. The ice began to melt in a perfect circle around the array, steam rising despite the sub-zero air. No water surged upward. Instead, the opening revealed a depth far greater than the lake's mapped measurements, a vertical darkness that swallowed the light from their headlamps. The hum ceased abruptly, replaced by a pressure Elias felt behind his eyes, a sense of being gently but firmly oriented toward the opening, like a compass needle settling. He backed away, slowly, every instinct screaming to run while knowing that movement was being measured. Behind him, the forest creaked, not with wind, but with the sound of weight shifting, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer. The lake did not pursue. It didn't need to. The water beneath the ice began to circulate faster, drawing heat, sound, and attention inward. The sensors overloaded one by one, screens flooding with white before going dark. As Elias turned to flee, he realized something that hollowed him out completely. The lake was not awakening. It was finishing a cycle. And the cycle required witnesses, not to survive, but to be remembered, just long enough for the pattern to repeat. The ice closed behind them without a sound. They never made it far from the lake. The snow began to fall heavier, but not from the sky. It drifted sideways from the forest, as if the trees were shedding it on purpose. Elias could no longer hear his own breathing. The cold had numbed his lungs into shallow, mechanical pulls of air. Behind them, the ice had already sealed itself completely, smooth and flawless, erasing the circle as if it had never existed. The lake looked inert again, perfectly still, a mirror reflecting nothing. The path back to the research cabins warped subtly the farther they went. Distances stretched, then compressed. 100 meters became a kilometer. Familiar landmarks appeared twice, then vanished altogether. Elias noticed that their footprints behind them were fading too quickly, filling in as though the snow resented being disturbed. When he stopped to mark a tree with his knife, the bark split easily, too easily, and beneath it was ice, clear and veined, pulsing faintly with the same rhythm they had heard beneath the lake. One by one, the others slowed, not from exhaustion, but from attention. Each of them began to turn their heads slightly toward the lake, even when it was no longer visible, as if some internal alignment was being corrected. Elias tried to shout, to force them forward, but his voice came out wrong, flattened by the cold, swallowed almost instantly. He realized with growing dread that the hum had returned, not in the air, but inside his chest, syncing with his heartbeat. The forest changed as they moved deeper into it. The trees grew closer together, trunks thicker, bark coated in a thin glaze of ice that reflected their headlamps back at them in fractured patterns. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending toward a single direction. Elias followed those lines with his eyes and felt a wave of vertigo when he understood they were all pointing back toward the lake, no matter where he stood. They found one of the old fishing huts again, though Elias was certain they had passed it earlier, miles closer to shore. This time, its door was closed. Frost coated the windows from the inside. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The interior was warm. Not heated,
preserved. The air inside was heavy and damp, carrying the smell of cold water and minerals. Along the walls were dozens of markings carved into the wood, overlapping generations of the same circular symbols, layered so densely they looked like scales. At the center of the room stood a crude table, and on it lay equipment older than their own by decades. Analog depth gauges, handwritten logs, reels of magnetic tape. Every page ended the same way, regardless of date. Observed, aligned, returned. Elias felt the pull then, unmistakable and overwhelming. A gentle insistence guiding his thoughts back toward the lake. Images surfaced in his mind that were not memories. A vast, lightless expanse beneath the ice. Slow currents spiraling around a central mass. Time passing not in days or years, but in pressure and depth. He understood now why the creature never surfaced, why it did not need to hunt. The lake itself was its boundary, its instrument, its method of reaching upward through repetition. Outside, something shifted. Not footsteps, displacement. The snow outside the hut settled inward, flattening, as if something immense had passed through without breaking the surface. The hum deepened again, stronger than before, and Elias realized with sick clarity that the lake did not need them to return physically. It had already begun to pull them back in pieces. When Elias stumbled out of the hut, the forest was gone. In its place stood an endless field of ice, stretching in all directions, smooth and pale, reflecting a dim, diffuse light with no visible source. Beneath the surface, shadows moved slowly, patiently, assembling themselves. The hum rose to a near-constant vibration, and Elias understood that the final phase was beginning. Not an escape, not a confrontation, but a correction. The lake was reclaiming its witnesses. The ice did not crack when it opened. It simply thinned, becoming translucent beneath Elias's feet, as if solidity itself were only a suggestion the lake no longer needed to honor. He could see far below now, deeper than any depth reading they had recorded, layers of darkness folding into one another like slow-moving tides. Shapes drifted there, vast and indistinct, not swimming but rotating, aligning themselves around a central absence. The thing they had named a creature was not one body, not even one mind. It was a system, ancient and self-correcting, using water and cold as its language. The others stood motionless beside him, eyes unfocused, faces calm in a way that terrified him more than panic ever could. Their breath no longer fogged the air. One of them stepped forward, then another, boots sinking into the ice without resistance, as if the surface recognized them. Elias tried to grab them, but his hands passed through their coats like they were already halfway elsewhere, their outlines blurring, losing priority over the space they occupied. The hum reached a steady, complete tone, not louder, not faster. Finished. Memories that were not his own poured into Elias's thoughts. Fishermen standing on the same lake a century earlier, staring into a glow beneath the ice. Surveyors marking the shoreline, only to find their maps subtly wrong the following morning. Researchers, soldiers, locals, all repeating the same mistake of observation. Each generation refined the process without understanding it, returning again and again, feeding the system with attention. The lake did not consume bodies, it consumed recognition. To be seen was to be included. Elias understood his role at last. He was not being taken because he was present. He was being taken because he understood. The ice beneath him warmed slightly, just enough to feel like skin. His boots sank. The cold no longer hurt. As he descended, the surface sealed above him without a ripple. erasing the last sign that anything had ever disturbed it. The shadows below resolved into structure, vast arcs of pale mass arranged around a hollow center where no light survived. The hum softened, becoming almost reassuring, like a held breath finally released. Days later, a rescue team would find the camp intact, equipment powered down, logs ending mid-sentence, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the lake. The ice would test solid. Depth readings would return normal.
The lake would be quiet again. But on certain nights, when the temperature dropped just enough, a faint glow would appear beneath the surface, and the water would hum, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as an invitation, patiently waiting for someone new to look long enough to understand. The plateau had no name on most maps, just a white emptiness stretching beyond the limits of certainty. No trees, no rocks tall enough to matter, no landmarks to hold on to. Snow lay everywhere in smooth, uninterrupted sheets, as if the world had been erased and redrawn in white. The wind moved gently across the surface, whispering rather than howling, and the sky hung low and pale, blurring the line between earth and air. It was the kind of place where direction became a suggestion rather than a fact, where distance lied, and where time felt thin. Evan had chosen this place precisely because of that. He wasn't chasing fame or footage dramatic enough for headlines. He came because this plateau had swallowed people quietly. Over the years, hikers, surveyors, and once even a rescue pilot had vanished here without distress calls, without wreckage, without answers. Just absence. Evan told himself he was here to document the terrain, to understand how people could get lost so completely in such an open space. In truth, there was something else. A need to stand where others had stopped existing, to see if the land itself held a reason. His boots pressed deep into the snow with each step, the sound dull and muted, quickly eaten by the cold air. He moved steadily, counting his pace, checking his compass more out of habit than trust. Everything looked the same, no matter which way he turned. The horizon curved softly, offering no clue as to how far he had come or how far he still had to go. After a while, he stopped to drink and turned back, wanting to mark his progress visually. That was when he noticed the second trail. At first, his mind rejected it. Two parallel lines of footprints ran behind him, close enough to feel intentional. One set was unmistakably his, familiar tread, consistent depth. The other was different, wider, pressed deeper into the snow, as if whatever made them carried more weight or moved with less hesitation. Evan stood still, heart slowing instead of racing, his brain trying to assemble a reasonable explanation. Wind couldn't do this. Animals didn't walk like that. No one else should have been there. He looked ahead, then back again. The footprints remained, perfectly clear, perfectly patient. Evan told himself it was perspective, fatigue, the mind's tendency to invent patterns when faced with monotony. He resumed walking, forcing a steady rhythm, refusing to turn again for several minutes. When he finally did, the second trail was still there, matching his path step for step, never crossing, never overlapping, just following. Not catching up, not falling behind, always behind. The cold began to feel different after that, not harsher, but aware. The silence thickened, pressing in on his thoughts.
Evan tried to remember the last sound he'd heard that wasn't his own movement, and realized he couldn't. Even the wind seemed careful now, brushing the snow without disturbing the trails. He stopped again, slower this time, bracing himself before looking back. The distance between the two sets of footprints had shortened, just slightly, but enough to notice. A strange thought settled in his mind, unwelcome and stubborn. Whatever was making those prints didn't need to hurry.
Evan adjusted his course, angling to the left, then sharply to the right, creating an obvious deviation. He walked longer than before, his breathing shallow, his focus narrowing to the crunch beneath his boots. When he finally turned, his stomach tightened. The second trail had followed every change flawlessly. The arc identical, the spacing unchanged. No hesitation, no mistake. He scanned the horizon, squinting against the pale glare, searching for movement, for a shape, for anything that could explain what he couldn't see. There was nothing. No figure, no shadow. Just endless snow and two lines that proved he was no longer alone, in a place where solitude should have been absolute. Evan didn't run. Running felt wrong, almost disrespectful, as if the land itself would notice. Instead, he stood there, staring at the footprints behind him, and understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever followed him did not exist where his eyes could meet it. It lived one step behind, one moment too late to be seen. He turned forward again and continued walking, the plateau stretching endlessly ahead, knowing that with every step he took, something was carefully placing its own footprints into the snow, waiting for him to do something other than move forward. Evan kept moving, not because he believed it would save him, but because stopping felt like an invitation he didn't yet understand. The plateau refused to change. The light remained flat and colorless, the sky an unbroken sheet of pale gray, the snow so uniform it erased any sense of progress. Distance became meaningless. He could have been walking for minutes or hours. His body felt the strain, but time itself seemed unwilling to mark his passage. After a while, he forced himself to look back again. The second trail was closer now. Not dramatically so, just enough to tighten something in his chest. The footprints were still deeper than his own, pressed cleanly into the snow as if whatever made them did not slip, did not hesitate, did not adjust its weight. They looked deliberate, patient. Evan noticed then that there was no sign of dragging, no uneven spacing, no sign of fatigue. The prints never overlapped his, never rushed to catch up. They simply existed, always a fixed number of steps behind, as though distance itself was being measured and respected. He tried to reason it out. Hallucination was the easiest answer, but it didn't hold. His mind wasn't fractured. His thoughts were clear, methodical. The cold was real, the snow was real, and so were the patterns behind him. He knelt briefly, brushing the surface of one of the Chujik footprints with a gloved hand. The snow inside it was compacted and cold, no warmer than the rest of the ground. Whatever had stepped there had not left heat behind. That realization unsettled him more than anything else so far. Evan stood and walked on, slower now, listening to his own breathing, aware of how loud it sounded in a place that absorbed everything else. He tried counting steps again, hoping numbers might anchor him. 50 forward, 100. He stopped abruptly, muscles tense, then waited several long seconds before turning. The second trail had stopped too. The prints ended exactly where his own ended, as if whatever followed him had mirrored not just his movement, but his decision to pause. Evan swallowed, a dry, painful motion. and stayed still longer than felt comfortable. The silence grew heavy, pressing against his ears. He had the sudden irrational sense that if he waited too long, something would change in a way he couldn't undo. When he finally moved again, the other footprints resumed as well. That was when the fear shifted. It was no longer the fear of being chased or hunted or attacked. It was the fear of being observed by something that didn't need to rush. Something that understood rules Evan did not. He realized he had been assuming the thing behind him was reacting to his movement. Now, it felt more accurate to say it was allowing it. The plateau offered no shelter, no variation, no distraction. Just white ground and white sky. Evan found himself thinking about the disappearances that had drawn him here. The reports always said the same thing. Clear weather, experienced individuals, no signs of struggle. Search teams found camps, equipment, even footprints, until suddenly they didn't. Trails that simply stopped, as if the person had stepped out of the world, rather than fallen or been taken. Evan wondered how many of them had noticed the second set of footprints before it was too late. He changed direction again, this time deliberately erratic, forcing sharp turns, doubling back briefly before correcting himself. His heart hammered as he walked longer than before, refusing to look, forcing his eyes forward until the muscles in his neck ached from the tension. When he finally turned, the result was the same. Perfect imitation. The second trail had followed every decision flawlessly, neither lagging nor closing the gap. Except now, the distance was shorter again. Evan felt a growing pressure in his thoughts. Not a voice, not an image, but a subtle insistence. The idea that this place did not punish movement. It punished hesitation. As long as he walked forward, the rules remained intact. The moment he stopped trying to go somewhere, the plateau would decide he was finished. He adjusted his pack and continued onward, knowing that somewhere behind him, unseen and unhurried, something was walking not to reach him, but to wait for the moment he no longer had a destination. By the time Evan realized the plateau no longer felt cold, he understood that something fundamental had shifted. The wind was still there, brushing lightly across the snow, but it carried no bite. The ache in his fingers dulled, replaced by a numb warmth that felt wrong, like a lie his body was being told. He slowed his pace despite himself, each step taking more effort than the last, not from exhaustion alone, but from the growing sense that the ground beneath him was no longer just ground. He looked back again. The second trail was dangerously close now. Only a few steps separated his footprints from the others. Up close, the size difference was undeniable. Each print was broader, deeper, shaped like something that understood walking but did not share the limits of human joints. The edges were too clean, the impressions too certain. Evan felt a flicker of instinctive terror, the kind that bypasses thought entirely. He resisted the urge to turn fully around, knowing with a clarity that chilled him far deeper than the air ever had, that if he did, he would see nothing. Whatever followed him existed only in the space he had already occupied. He remembered an old account he had dismissed years earlier while researching disappearances in polar regions. A journal fragment recovered from the snow, its author unnamed, its final lines shaky and uneven. The man had written about being followed by his own past, about something that refused to walk beside him or ahead of him, something that respected only one rule: never be seen. Evan had thought it metaphorical at the time, the product of isolation and cold. Now the memory settled into place like a missing piece.
He tried to test a theory that had been forming quietly in his mind. Slowly, deliberately, Evan reduced his pace, each step shorter than the last. His breathing became shallow, controlled. He counted again, forcing structure onto the moment. 10 steps. 5. 3. He stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Evan stood perfectly still, muscles trembling, ears straining for a sound that never came. The silence pressed against him, dense and intimate, as if the plateau itself had leaned closer. He waited longer than he wanted to, longer than felt safe, then turned his head just enough to glance back. The second trail ended directly behind him. No gap, no distance. Just the final print, pressed deep into the snow, so close it felt like a hand resting on his spine without touching. Evan's heart hammered violently as he turned forward again, resisting the urge to run, knowing instinctively that running would change nothing. The rule was clear now. Movement forward maintained separation. Stopping erased it. He began walking again, faster than before, not in panic but in grim compliance. The warmth followed him, spreading through his limbs, dulling the sharp edges of fear. His thoughts slowed, growing heavy, as if the cold was no longer outside him, but inside his head. He wondered how long he had been out there, whether the sky had shifted at all, whether time still applied to a place like this. Another realization surfaced, quieter but more terrifying than the rest. The thing behind him was not learning from him. It already knew how this ended. It had walked this pattern before, step for step, with others who had believed they were moving towards something. Safety, answers, escape, until they no longer were. Evan kept walking, his footprints stretching ahead into the endless white, aware that every step forward was not delaying an attack, but postponing a decision the plateau was patiently waiting for him to make. Evan no longer believed the plateau was empty. The absence of features, the perfect uniformity of snow and sky, now felt deliberate, like a controlled environment rather than a natural one. The further he walked, the more convinced he became that direction itself was being permitted rather than chosen. His compass still worked, the needle steady, but it pointed with the confidence of something that had never mattered here. He needed to know if the rule could be broken. The idea formed slowly, carefully, the way dangerous ideas always do when the mind has too much silence to work with. If the thing behind him existed only in the space he had already occupied, then perhaps the only way to see it was to remove that space entirely. Not to stop, not to hesitate, but to deny it the past it relied on. Evan turned sharply and began walking backward.
The movement felt wrong immediately. His balance faltered, his boots slipping slightly as his eyes struggled to process the world in reverse. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, on what had been behind him only moments before, and took slow, deliberate steps, forcing himself not to look down. The plateau stretched the same way in all directions, offering no reaction, no resistance. After several steps, he stopped and looked down. There were 2 sets of footprints again. His own, reversed and uneven now, and the others, still there, still deeper, still perfect, now positioned behind him in the new direction of travel. The distance between them had not changed. A quiet certainty settled over him. The rule was not about forward motion. It was about intent. As long as he was trying to leave, trying to go somewhere, the pattern held. The plateau did not care which way he faced. It cared whether he was moving toward an end. Evan laughed once, a short, brittle sound that vanished immediately into the cold. He tried something else. He walked in a wide circle, widening it gradually, then tightening it again,
deliberately breaking any illusion of progress. When he stopped and turned, the second trail had traced the circle perfectly, never intersecting, never hesitating. The shape was so precise it felt like mockery. The warmth returned, stronger now. It crept into his chest, his neck, his face, dulling the sharp edge of panic and replacing it with something dangerously close to relief. His thoughts softened. The plateau no longer seemed hostile. It felt calm, patient, as if it had all the time he did not. Evan realized then that exhaustion was no longer his enemy. Comfort was. He forced himself onward, though his steps grew slower, heavier, each one requiring more intention than the last. The sky dimmed subtly, not darkening exactly, but losing contrast, blending into the snow until the world felt unfinished. He had the unsettling impression that if he stopped concentrating, if he let himself drift, he would simply fade into the background like everything else. He thought of the missing, not as victims now, but as participants in the same quiet negotiation. Each of them must have walked as long as they could, believing movement was safety, until fatigue or doubt or acceptance convinced them to pause. The plateau didn't chase. It didn't drag. It waited. Evan slowed despite himself. The warmth spread further, sinking deep into his muscles, easing the pain in his legs, his back, his shoulders. He felt lighter, less defined, as though the effort of being a person was becoming optional. He stopped counting steps. He stopped checking direction. For the first time since arriving, he considered what it might be like to simply stand still and let the world decide. The moment that thought settled, the air changed. Not with sound, but with presence. The silence grew closer, heavier, no longer surrounding him, but pressing in from behind. Evan felt the unmistakable sensation of proximity, of something occupying the space just beyond touch. He did not turn. He did not need to. The rule had never been about sight. It was about allowance. Evan took one last step forward, not toward a destination, but away from the decision forming in his mind. The effort felt immense, disproportionate, as if the plateau itself resisted the idea of continuation. His foot came down slowly, deliberately. Behind him, the other footprints landed closer than ever before. Evan understood now that the pattern could not be broken, only completed. Evan stood at the edge of exhaustion, not the kind that burns or trembles, but the deeper kind that settles quietly and convinces you that stopping is reasonable. The plateau no longer felt vast. It felt intimate, like a closed room with no walls. Snow, sky, and distance blurred into a single pale surface, and for the first time since arriving, Evan could no longer tell whether he was moving through the landscape or being held in place by it. He took another step, then another, each one slower than the last. The warmth wrapped around him fully now, gentle and persuasive, draining urgency from his thoughts. The fear that had driven him forward faded, replaced by a strange clarity. He understood the rule completely. The thing behind him did not kill. It did not hunt. It simply waited for a person to stop choosing a future. Evan stopped. There was no sound when it happened, no impact, no breath on his neck, no sudden movement in the corner of his eye. The silence deepened, thick enough to feel. He sensed the space behind him change, not by closing in, but by becoming complete. The distance he had been protecting with every step was gone. When Evan turned, there was still nothing to see. No shape, no figure, no outline against the snow. Only the plateau, unbroken and calm. Yet the warmth intensified, flowing through him until his limbs felt heavy and distant, as if they no longer belonged to him. His thoughts slowed, thinning out, each one dissolving before it could fully form. The effort of standing became unnecessary. The effort of being separate from the place beneath his feet felt unnatural. He lowered himself to the snow without resistance. The cold did not return. The ground beneath him felt firm, steady, almost welcoming. Above, the sky remained pale and empty, offering no sense of time passing. Evan realized, dimly, that this was how the others had vanished. Not taken, not destroyed, but relieved of the need to continue. The plateau did not erase people. It absorbed the moment they stopped becoming someone who was going somewhere. When the search team arrived days later, the weather was calm and visibility perfect. They found Evan's pack, his equipment neatly arranged where he had last stood. They found his footprints stretching out across the snow, steady and purposeful. They also found a second trail. 2 sets of footprints ran together for a short distance, side by side, before merging into one. After that, there were no more tracks at all. Just clean, untouched snow, stretching endlessly in every direction, waiting for the next person who believed that as long as they kept moving, they would be safe. The station was officially listed as White Ridge Meteorological Outpost, though no one who had ever worked there called it that. Among technicians, pilots, and logistics crews, it was known simply as White Ridge. A steel structure anchored into frozen rock high in the Alaskan interior, surrounded by nothing but snowfields, cliffs, and wind-carved emptiness. In winter, no roads led to it. Once the helicopter lifted off at the start of the season, the world beyond the ridge effectively ceased to exist. Ethan had taken the contract because it paid well and because it promised silence. He had spent years rotating through remote monitoring posts, offshore platforms, and relay stations where human contact was minimal. White Ridge was supposed to be more of the same. 3 months alone, maintaining weather instruments, logging atmospheric data, and keeping the generators alive until spring. The building itself felt older than the paperwork suggested. Its walls were thick, layered with insulation and reinforced steel, yet the cold still found its way inside. The structure never truly settled. It groaned under shifting temperatures, metal contracting and expanding in slow, irregular rhythms that sounded uncomfortably like breathing. The first few nights passed quietly. Ethan followed routine. He logged pressure changes, calibrated sensors, and sent reports on schedule. During the day, visibility came and went with the storms. At night, the darkness outside pressed so tightly against the windows that they reflected the interior like mirrors, making it feel as though the station floated in an endless black void. On the 4th night, just after 2 a.m., Ethan noticed something outside the east-facing window. At first, he thought it was debris from the storm. Snow piled unevenly against the base of the structure all the time. But when he leaned closer to the glass, flashlight in hand, the shapes resolved into something unmistakable. Footprints. They were enormous, bare, human in shape, but wrong in scale. Each impression sank deep into the snow, spaced evenly apart, as if whoever made them walked calmly, unhurried, circling the station with deliberate precision. No drag marks, no signs of slipping, no indication of panic. They formed a near-perfect ring around the outpost. Ethan checked the timestamp on the nearest camera feed. There was no recorded movement, no shadow crossing the snow, just empty white terrain, and then the tracks, as though they had appeared fully formed. He considered stepping outside to inspect them more closely, but the wind picked up suddenly, slamming against the walls with enough force to rattle the fixtures. By the time the gusts died down, blowing snow had already begun to soften the edges of the impressions. By morning, they were gone. Ethan told himself it was wind distortion. Snowdrifts can mimic shapes, especially under artificial light. The brain fills in gaps when it wants meaning. Still, he logged the sighting under environmental anomalies, using neutral language and avoiding speculation. The following night, the tracks returned. Identical. Same size, same spacing. They followed the exact same circular route, stopping just short of the station's shadow. Ethan reviewed every external camera feed. None showed movement, not even a flicker. He began searching through archived station logs, some dating back decades. Most entries were mundane: temperature fluctuations, equipment failures, storm warnings, but scattered among them were notes that stood out, written in different handwriting, sometimes hastily, sometimes carefully controlled. Large tracks observed again, no visual confirmation. Movement during whiteout. Avoid exterior checks at night. Unclear origin. Recommend no escalation. One report from the early 1980s had an entire paragraph blacked out. Another ended abruptly, followed by weeks of missing entries. In the margins of an older logbook, someone had written a single sentence in faded ink. It walks when the wind stops. That night, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. The station seemed to shrink around Ethan, every sound amplified by its absence. He sat at the console, listening to his own breathing, the faint hum of electronics suddenly intrusive. Then came a sound from outside, a single crunch. Too heavy for drifting snow, too slow to be debris. A footstep. Ethan's eyes snapped to the monitors. One by one, the feeds flickered as static crawled across the screens. When the images stabilized, Camera 3 showed a shape standing just beyond the edge of its range. Tall, broad, pale against the snow. It didn't move. It didn't approach. It simply stood there, facing the station, as though observing it in return. The feed glitched again. The shape was gone. Moments later, Ethan noticed fresh impressions forming in the snow below the window. Not circling the station this time, they stopped directly beneath the glass. And beside them, overlapping slightly, were Ethan's own footprints from earlier that evening. Ethan didn't remember stepping outside that night. That realization settled in slowly, like cold seeping through layers of clothing. He stood by the window for a long time, staring down at the overlapping tracks, trying to reconstruct the timeline. He knew he had checked the generator enclosure earlier in the evening, just after sunset, but the snow pattern beneath the window told a different story. His footprints were fresh, sharply defined, pressed deep as if he had been standing there longer than he could account for. He rewound the interior security feed. The camera covered the main room, the equipment corridor, and the airlock. Between 1:40 and 2:15 a.m., there was nothing unusual at first. Ethan moved normally, logging data, pouring coffee, pacing to stay awake. Then, at exactly 1:57, The footage skipped forward 3 minutes. Not a glitch, a clean jump, as if those minutes had been deliberately removed. When the image resumed, the airlock door was open, and Ethan was gone from the frame. He rewatched it twice more, his pulse rising. The external cameras offered no help. During the same window of missing time, every outside feed showed static or a frozen image of empty snow. The station logs showed no recorded airlock cycle. Someone had opened it manually. Ethan checked his hands. The skin around his knuckles was raw, reddened by cold exposure. His fingertips ached in a way that suggested more than a few seconds outside. When he pulled up his sleeve, he found faint bruising along his forearm, dark shapes beneath the skin, as if something had gripped him too tightly. The rational explanations felt thin now. He told himself it was sleep deprivation, a dissociative episode brought on by isolation. The mind could do strange things under prolonged stress. That explanation was safer than the alternative.
Still, he barricaded the airlock with a secondary steel brace before returning to the console. At 3:12 a.m., the seismic sensor pinged. White Ridge wasn't meant to register anything heavier than minor ice shifts or distant avalanches. But the reading that appeared on Ethan's screen wasn't random. It showed a rhythmic pattern. Heavy impacts, evenly spaced, moving upslope toward the station. Each registered vibration was strong enough to suggest tremendous mass. Whatever was out there was walking upright. Ethan switched to thermal imaging. At first, the screen showed nothing but cold gradients and static noise. Then a shape bloomed into view at the edge of the display, massive and asymmetrical, radiating heat in stark contrast to the frozen environment. The figure stood well over 8 feet tall, its outline blurred by thick layers of muscle and fur. The heat signature wasn't uniform. Its chest glowed hotter than it should have, as if something inside it burned differently than flesh. The figure moved closer, and Ethan felt the vibration through the floor before the sensor registered it. Each step caused the metal beneath his boots to hum faintly, a low resonance that made his teeth ache. He forced himself to breathe slowly and reached for the radio. White Ridge had an emergency uplink that bypassed routine communication channels, used only for evacuation-level incidents. Ethan keyed it in and waited for the signal to lock. Nothing. The screen displayed a message he had never seen before. Line occupied. Occupied by what, he didn't know. The uplink had no call history, no incoming transmission. It was simply unavailable, as if something else was already using it. A deep sound rolled across the ridge then, low and resonant, not quite a roar. It carried through the walls and into Ethan's chest, vibrating his ribs. It wasn't aggressive in tone. It sounded more like a call, sustained and deliberate, as if meant to carry over long distances. The thermal image flared, then vanished. All external feeds went dark. The station lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized, though the hum of the generators dropped into an uneven rhythm. Ethan backed away from the console, his instincts screaming that whatever separation existed between him and the thing outside was growing thinner. From somewhere beneath the station, ice cracked. Not the sharp report of shifting snow, but the deep fracture of something structural giving way. Ethan grabbed his coat and flashlight and moved toward the maintenance corridor, despite every part of him wanting to stay put. The lower access tunnel led to the station's foundation supports, partially exposed to the rock face. As he descended,
The temperature dropped sharply, breath fogging thick in the beam of his light. The smell hit him first. A strong animal musk, layered with something metallic and old. The flashlight caught movement ahead. At the far end of the tunnel, the reinforced steel panel covering the external crawl space had been bent inward. Not torn, bent. Curved smoothly, as if molded by pressure rather than force. Frost clung to the edges, melting slowly, dripping onto the concrete floor. Embedded in the metal were impressions that looked disturbingly like fingers. Ethan stepped back, heart pounding, and that was when he heard breathing. It came from above him, from inside the walls. A slow, measured inhale, followed by an exhale that whistled faintly through unseen passages. The sound traveled through the structure, impossible to pinpoint, as though the station itself had lungs. The breathing stopped. Silence followed, thick and expectant. Then, very close to his ear, something outside the range of normal hearing produced a low, clicking sound, deliberate and patterned, like a language built from bone and air. Ethan ran. He didn't stop until he was back in the main room, slamming the door behind him and locking it with shaking hands. The monitors flickered back to life one by one. Every camera showed empty snow. Except one. Camera 3 now pointed directly at the east wall of the station. Pressed against the metal siding was a massive, fur-covered shape, its outline distorted by proximity. A single dark eye filled the frame, unblinking, reflective, far too intelligent to belong to an animal. As Ethan watched, frost began to spread outward from where it touched the wall, crawling across the metal in branching patterns. The figure leaned closer, and inside Ethan's head, uninvited and unmistakable, came a sensation not of fear, but of recognition, as if something that had been searching for him for a very long time had finally confirmed his location. The cold inside the station changed sometime after midnight. Ethan noticed it not as a sudden drop, but as a quiet pressure, as if the air itself had thickened. The heaters were still running, their low mechanical hum steady and familiar. Yet his breath began to fog again, faint clouds forming and dissolving in front of his face. He rubbed his hands together, feeling the ache in his knuckles deepen, the kind of pain that didn't come from temperature alone, but from something older, something that felt remembered by the body rather than felt for the first time. The camera feeds were unchanged at a glance. Snow drifting sideways across the eastern ridge, the tree line standing black and skeletal against the white, the access road empty and already half buried again. But when Ethan leaned closer to the monitors, he realized what had been bothering him. The snow was falling wrong. Not faster, not heavier, just uneven. In certain sections of the feed, flakes seemed to hesitate, as if passing through pockets of thicker air. In one camera view, near the boundary markers, the snowfall bent inward, subtly curving around a space that should have been empty. He adjusted the contrast, then the brightness. Nothing resolved into a clear shape, just the sense of absence, a distortion where the forest should have been untouched. His stomach tightened. He told himself it was fatigue, altitude sickness, too many hours staring at screens. Still, he marked the timestamp in the log, his handwriting smaller than before, cramped, as if the pen resisted his grip. He stood and walked the length of the station, boots echoing dully against concrete. The hallway lights flickered in their usual rhythm, but now the shadows between pulses felt deeper, longer, like pauses in a breath. When he passed the storage room, he slowed. The door was closed, just as he had left it, but the smell leaking from beneath it made him stop completely. Damp earth, old snow, and something faintly metallic, like blood diluted by ice. He opened the door. The room was unchanged, Shelves lined with emergency rations, spare cables, weather instruments, flares. But on the far wall, just above the floor, the frost pattern had shifted. It wasn't random anymore. Lines pressed outward from a central point, long arcs etched into the ice as if something had leaned there, heavy and deliberate. Ethan crouched, heart pounding, and raised his flashlight. The beam revealed shallow grooves beneath the frost, scratches in the concrete itself, too wide and too evenly spaced to be animal marks. As he stared, a memory surfaced without warning. Not a clear image, but a sensation. Snow up to his knees, his radio crackling with static, a shape moving parallel to him in the trees, never breaking cover, never rushing. He straightened abruptly, breath sharp, confused by the certainty of it. He had never been out here before taking this job. Had he? Back in the control room, he pulled open the lower drawer of the main desk, searching for distraction, for anything to anchor him. Instead, his fingers closed around a thin folder he did not remember seeing before. No label on the tab. Inside were photocopied reports, yellowed with age. Weather anomalies, missing equipment, unexplained personnel transfers, and then names. One of them was his. Not typed, handwritten in the margin of a report dated 17 years earlier. Same spelling, same looping capital E. Beneath it, a note. Subject exhibits familiarity with zone despite no prior assignment. Ethan sat heavily in the chair, the station creaking softly around him. His pulse roared in his ears. He flipped through the pages faster now, breath shallow. Several reports referenced White Ridge not as a monitoring station, but as a buffer. A line. Something built to watch, not weather patterns, but movement. Presence. The language grew more cautious the deeper he read, words replaced by euphemisms, references to the observer, the high trace, the one that waits above the snow. A low sound rolled through the station then, deep enough that he felt it in his chest before he heard it. Not a roar, not a howl, more like the vibration of something massive shifting its weight far away. The lights dimmed, surged, then steadied. On every monitor at once, the tree line moved. Not swaying, parting. Snow billowed outward as something passed between the trunks, too large to be concealed, yet never fully visible. The cameras struggled to focus, pixels tearing and reassembling as if the system itself resisted showing a clear image. For a single frame, just one, Ethan saw an outline. Tall, broad. Its head brushed the lower branches without slowing. Pale shapes marked its face. Not eyes exactly, but reflective hollows that caught the camera's infrared and flared briefly, like distant stars seen through fog. The feed cut to static. The radio on the desk clicked on by itself. No call sign, no channel indicator, just a slow, rhythmic sound, like breath passing through a narrow space. Ethan did not reach to turn it off. He knew, with a certainty that felt ancient, that it wasn't a transmission. It was an acknowledgement. The station had not failed. The perimeter had not been breached. The boundary had been reached. And something on the other side had finally decided that Ethan remembered enough. By the time the static cleared, the station no longer felt like a structure built by people. It felt provisional, like a thin shell left behind after something larger had molted. Ethan sat perfectly still, listening to the radio breathe. Each exhale carried a faint rasp, as if ice were being ground between enormous teeth. He told himself that if he stayed quiet long enough, the sound would fade, that the system would reset the way it always did after a storm surge or a power dip. But the sound did not fade. It grew more deliberate, slower,
as though whatever produced it had learned the dimensions of the room and was adjusting its rhythm to match his. He reached for the radio with 2 fingers and turned the volume knob. The sound didn't change. He turned it all the way down. Still, nothing changed. The breathing was no longer coming from the speaker. It was in the walls, in the floor, carried through the steel supports like a vibration traveling through bone. When he stood, the sensation intensified, his teeth clicking softly together without his consent. The monitors flickered back to life, one by one. Camera 3 showed the access road again, empty, smooth, untouched. Camera 5, facing the upper slope, showed nothing but white glare where the snow reflected too much light. But Camera 7, the one no one ever paid attention to because it faced a blind angle of forest too steep to traverse, showed movement. The trees were closer together there, their trunks warped by decades of wind. Between them, something pale shifted, not crossing the frame, but adjusting its posture, as if settling in. Ethan zoomed in until the image broke apart into blocks of color. In the distortion, a pattern emerged. Long vertical lines, evenly spaced. Then a curve, too smooth to be bark or rock. The shape did not advance. It waited. Snow gathered along its surface without melting, clinging to it as if it belonged there. As if the cold was not an obstacle, but a shared environment. A sharp crack echoed outside, loud enough to make Ethan flinch. Not thunder, wood snapping under pressure. Then another, closer this time, followed by a deep, resonant thud that traveled up through the ground and into the station's foundation. The building responded with a long, tired groan. Dust drifted from the ceiling seams. Ethan backed away from the monitors and grabbed his coat, shrugging it on with clumsy urgency. He told himself he needed to check the exterior sensors. That protocol required a visual confirmation after a perimeter anomaly. The words felt hollow even as he thought them. Protocol had been written by people who believed the forest was empty. The moment he opened the main door, the cold hit him like a physical force. Not wind, not weather, but density, as if the air itself resisted being displaced. His breath froze in his throat, sharp and painful. The floodlights cast harsh cones across the snowfield, illuminating nothing but drifting flakes and long shadows. Too long. Shadows that stretched at impossible angles, pointing away from the tree line instead of toward it. He stepped out anyway. The snow under his boots was unbroken for several meters, pristine and deceptively calm. Then he saw the tracks. They were not fresh, yet they had not been buried either. Each impression was deep, far deeper than a human footprint, pressed into layers of compacted snow that should have resisted that kind of weight. The spacing between them was wrong, too wide, too deliberate. Not a gate, but a measured placement, as if the thing that made them did not need to hurry. Ethan followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared beneath the station itself. His stomach dropped. He crouched and shone his flashlight under the raised platform. The beam caught on packed snow, disturbed cables, and then on something that made his breath hitch. More scratches, deeper this time, carved into the metal supports. Not random, parallel, intentional. As if fingers had tested the structure, memorizing its shape. As if the station had been examined from below, catalogued. A low sound rolled through the forest again, closer now. So close that Ethan felt it vibrate behind his eyes. The floodlights flickered, dimmed, then flared brighter than before. For a brief, terrible moment, the darkness beyond the light moved. It stood at the edge of illumination, refusing to step fully into view. Taller than any man, its silhouette hunched not from weakness, but from habit, as though it had learned long ago to move beneath branches that no longer constrained it. Its surface was a layered white, not fur exactly, but something denser, matted and ridged like snow that had learned to grow. When it shifted, the movement was slow and economical, wasting nothing. Ethan's mind supplied a word he had avoided until now. Yeti, Bigfoot, names given by people who needed things to be simple. This was neither legend nor animal. It did not behave like prey or predator. It behaved like a presence that had never needed to explain itself. The thing tilted its head. Ethan felt the pressure immediately, a weight settling behind his eyes, bringing with it images that were not memories, but impressions. The station rising from the snow decades ago. Men in heavy coats unloading equipment with shaking hands. Warnings spoken quietly, then written down, then crossed out. A boundary drawn not to keep people out, but to keep something in. Or, perhaps, to give it space. He stumbled back, gasping, and the pressure eased slightly, as if the thing had noticed his reaction and adjusted. He understood then that it was not attacking. It was observing, measuring his response the way it had measured the station's supports. The radio crackled inside the building, loud enough to be heard even through the closed door behind him. A voice emerged, distorted but unmistakably human, reciting a familiar phrase from the old logs. Subject exhibits familiarity with zone. Ethan laughed, a short, broken sound torn out of him by fear and disbelief. The thing at the edge of the light shifted again, one massive arm moving just enough for him to see the shape of it. The unnatural articulation of joints that bent not like a man's, but like something adapted to climbing ice and stone for centuries. It took one step forward. The ground trembled, subtle but undeniable. Snow slid from the station roof in a soft cascade. Ethan knew then that the boundary was no longer theoretical. Whatever rule had kept the thing distant had been tested enough times to wear thin. And now, after years of watching, of waiting, it had decided that the night guard was no longer just a witness. He was part of the system. As the floodlights began to fail one by one, plunging the forest back into darkness, Ethan understood that the stories were wrong. The creature was not drawn to isolation because it hunted the lost. It stayed here because this was where it was supposed to be. And tonight, it was checking to see if the station still remembered why. Ethan did not remember deciding to go back inside. One moment, he was standing at the edge of the failing floodlights, staring at the immense shape half claimed by darkness. And the next, he was inside the station, with the door sealed behind him, his hands pressed flat against the metal, as if the building itself might steady him. The cold no longer felt external. It had followed him in, clinging to the air, seeping into the walls, settling into the spaces between thoughts. The radio was still on, not crackling now, not hissing. It transmitted in a clean, stable channel that should not have been possible with the storm building outside. The same voice repeated itself at long, careful intervals, as though giving him time to understand. It spoke of parameters and thresholds, of observation cycles and compliance, of containment, not in the sense of imprisonment, but of balance. Ethan moved through the station slowly, every step deliberate.
The monitors no longer showed live feeds. Instead, they displayed archived footage layered over the present, images bleeding into one another. Men from decades ago walked through the snow outside, their outlines thin and jittering, their faces hollowed by cold and purpose. They carried instruments that resembled scientific equipment only in the loosest sense, devices assembled from necessity rather than understanding. In several frames, something pale loomed just beyond the edge of the picture, never fully captured, always implied. He understood then what the station really was. Not a lookout, not a research post, a witness point. A fixed human presence meant to anchor something older, something that existed comfortably outside of human definitions, but required acknowledgement to remain dormant. The logs, the protocols, the endless repetition of night shifts were not about vigilance. They were about continuity. Someone had to be here. Someone had to observe without interfering. Someone had to remember. The voice on the radio changed. It stopped using technical language and returned to something simpler, almost gentle. It explained, without emotion, that the cycle was degrading, that the station had been unattended too often, that automation had replaced intention. The thing in the forest had noticed. It did not resent this, but it could not ignore it either. Systems left unobserved eventually drifted. Boundaries softened, and when that happened, correction was required. Ethan felt the weight of the night settle fully onto him then. Not fear anymore, but inevitability. The creature had not approached out of hunger or curiosity. It had come because the station had failed to fulfill its role, and now, faced with a human who could still see, still understand, it had paused. Outside, the ground trembled again, closer than before. Snow slid down the windows in slow sheets, briefly revealing a towering silhouette that filled the entire frame before darkness reclaimed it. The building groaned, not in protest, but in recognition. Ethan returned to the central console and opened the oldest logbook. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the final entries were unmistakable. Each ended the same way, written in different hands across different decades. A name, a date, a single sentence beneath it. Station acknowledged. Cycle continues. His hands shook as he picked up the pen. He knew what writing his name there meant. It was not a sacrifice in the dramatic sense, no ritual, no blood, just acceptance. The understanding that some places required caretakers not to defend humanity from monsters, but to remind humanity that it was not alone, nor in control. The radio went quiet as he finished writing. For the first time since the storm began, the forest fell silent. Ethan sat down in the guard's chair and faced the monitors. Outside, the snow began to settle. The creature's presence receded, not retreating, but returning to a state of patient stillness, reassured by acknowledgement. The floodlights flickered back to steady life. Power normalized. Systems stabilized. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time felt less rigid now. Its edges softened. When the morning crew arrived, they found the station intact. The logs were complete, the equipment functional. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage beyond what years of weather had already done. They remarked, casually, that the night had been unusually calm. They did not comment on the extra name in the logbook. Ethan was never officially reported missing. His badge was logged as surrendered, his final shift marked as complete. And deep in the forest, beneath layers of snow that never fully melted, something vast and ancient resumed its quiet vigil, satisfied that the boundary had been seen, remembered, and upheld. The station would stand for a while longer, and someone would always be there,